important than the assessment itself. And you're absolutely right, and it's not just in K through 12. You find it everywhere. Once you create a situation, and country by country, it is even more prevalent. But in some societies and in some areas, the concept of training to test is almost become ingrained. Good example is China. Cisco, which has very rigorous certification programs, Cisco has to change their certification content in China every 30 days. Why is that? The beginning of the month, when they release a new test, pass rates are down around 25%. By the end of the month, pass rates are up near 100%. Why? Because China has always had a meritocracy based on testing. And it has become standard and acceptable in China that you go take a test and tell your brother 10 questions that you could remember. And he takes the test and he tells the nephew that 10 questions plus the other. So by the end of the month, everybody knows all the questions that are on the test. So how assessments are structured is very critical in that area. We were talking earlier about the system that sits there and looks at what you're searching for and then starts pushing information to you. There is a process of assessment called item response theory, and it does exactly that in the assessment process. It looks at how fast you answer a question, how many questions you're getting correct, the level of difficulty of the questions you're getting correct, and then it pushes different levels of difficulty of questions to you to adjust to your level of knowledge. So two people sitting next to each other taking the exact same assessment are not going to see the same questions. So yeah, I mean, my wife is actually in K through 12 education, and it drives people crazy that are not the teachers that are trying to get their kids through, or the principals or the administrators or the superintendents. It's a big problem when you get a training to test type of environment, because you're not in fact finding out if the person is competent, you're finding out how well they can take a test. Think about it, and this isn't, since this was just on TV, I'll use an example. Spelling bees. You're mostly testing, in the case of most kids in a spelling bee, you're testing their ability to memorize a lot of words. You're not testing their knowledge or skills. Yes?
It always seems to me in that issue of training to test, that's exactly the right way to do it. And the fault is not with the training, the fault is with the test. If the test is adequately broad enough and adequately unpredictable enough, then if you train to pass the test, what you have to train is the whole scope
exactly.
of what
exactly.
right.
And that actually points up the two major different categories of assessment. You have what's typically called end-of-course assessment. End-of-course assessment is testing whether or not an individual has retained the fundamental knowledge provided in that course. 2 + 2 = 4, 1776, Declaration of Independence, etc. And then you have what's called proficiency testing or competency testing. Proficiency or competency testing is a much more complicated and extensive form of testing. And it uses things like item response theory. It uses different techniques to ensure that what you're doing is evaluating a person's competency across a broad spectrum. For example, an insurance agent on a specific line of insurance. You might have an item bank of 1,000 different questions covering the entire body of knowledge that they're expected to know. They may be presented with 250 of those items to take a test. If they do sufficiently well on the different sections of those 250 questions, then you can be fairly confident that they can perform at the minimum level of competence in that particular field. And that's what this does. First you have to know what they need to know. You assess them to determine what they know, and then you do the remedial training, you tailor the training to their need, you push or pull so that they have the knowledge that they need to have. And that's what we call the virtuous cycle. So we view learning as a process that starts with assess, learn, assess, learn. It's a lifelong process versus an end-state activity. So combining the two, the virtuous cycle and the nexus of learning and the run-together sentence,
very well done.
You can get tailored information for the individual learning that provides those relevant skills.
Great segue. There's that sentence, and you brought it right back. You brought it full virtual cycle. Thank you so much. Okay, wrapping up. Let's look at some examples of the nexus in learning in action. One thing that intrigues me so much, and it's not just the Navy, we'll say I'm sure the Army feels the same way, and the other branches, but you know, there's an element of train in peace, stay alive in war. I mean, this actually is printed in gigantic letters on all of the buildings at the naval training centers. And so they view training as mission critical, and it's role based. So each person has a specific role and they train to that role. And the way they train, the three laws of learning for them is practice, practice, and practice. Okay, so formal training 10%, demonstration 25%, this is the guru, and then 65% practice. So what we did is we built sandboxes and live experiential systems around IT for the Navy so that they could get that experiential learning component. And this is very much on the job, or in the job kind of training.
So that was for the practice component.
Yes, that was, well, it was for the demonstration and the practice, so we covered about 90%. You know, they were very much driven towards, but it is structured in the sense that we built, let's say, about 100 lab exercises that were about half an hour to an hour long. So that element was structured. We determined what the boundary of content was. It wasn't just anything. And then we delivered them live equipment so that they could go in, you know, kind of in an on-the-job way. Yes?
How many objectives did you try to teach within these events, and then also at what level of expertise were you hoping that they would achieve?
Yeah, we had various levels of expertise. So, you know, they would start kind of at the basic level, which might be CompTIA-like, and then they would go up to JNC, they call it, which is a Journeyman Networking Core, which is maybe could solve a few simple problems on a ship. Would maybe go out with a ship because the ships have fairly sophisticated networks on them with Cisco routers and Microsoft servers. And then the ultimate level was ANA, Advanced Networking Analyst, who would then be the one kind of building those systems on the ships and managing them. And each of these programs was 6 weeks long. And each program probably had a couple hundred objectives. And the objectives were tied to job task analysis, obviously, as well. British Telecom, a slightly different situation. You know, that I think the Navy was much more in the job kind of practice, practice, practice. This was business transformation. Here's a company. If you've all, I don't know if you've heard of the BT1 kind of approach to the 21CN, they're calling it, the 21st Century Network, but it's a $15 billion project in the UK where they're going to rebuild the entire networking infrastructure, communications infrastructure of the UK. Huge grant from the government over the next 8 to 10 years. And so they had to take 100,000 engineers and transfer them from telecommunication experts to internet protocol. But they wanted to do it in the field. So again, experiential learning, they didn't have time to take them and put them in a classroom, but they wanted to put them in these kind of known good environments, these sandbox environments. So they started with the BT engineers, and then it spread kind of like wildfire, where then it would empower the BT ecosystem, all the vendors that were part of 21CN like Huawei and Cisco and Alcatel, et cetera, and then ultimately to customers.